Interesting conversation. Gernot's left time for discussion, and our side conversation leading up to his talk, anyhow, he has a really rich background and lots of experience in this area. It's a real pleasure to introduce and welcome Gernot Laganda to F&ES. Gernot is a 2016 World Fellow. He's going to be here until the middle of December. He's an incredible resource for us here at Yale and us especially here at F&ES. He's already offered to return to F&ES and speak with students in small discussion groups around issues around climate change adaptation, around UN politics, around a number of different things. Gernot is the lead technical specialist for climate change at the UN International Fund for Agricultural Development. The International Fund for Agricultural Development is one of the 3 UN agencies out of Rome. The other one is the World Food Programme and the UN FAO. And I think Gernot's going to tell us a little bit more about the International Fund for Agricultural Development. He coordinates the world's largest program to focus on strengthening the resilience of smallholder farmers in developing countries, really increasing their resilience against climate change. I find it really interesting that his background is very technical. His advanced degrees are in geosciences. He started in the petroleum industry. I think he'll talk a little bit about how he wove his way into his current career now. So I'm going to leave it at that and just please join me in welcoming Gernot.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's an incredible honor and pleasure to be here with you today. I don't know how many of you know the World Fellows Program. Our lives look pretty much like the lives of a time traveler, right? So we step out of a very busy full-time job with the private sector or an NGO or a government, or in my case, a UN agency, and then we parachute into this really fascinating world of intellectual discovery, inquiry, curiosity, and it's a bit like, being 20 years old again. It's fantastic. And also, when you're 20 years old, you arrive at a new campus, you try to take your bearings, you try to find out where are the labs, where are the environment people, where are the natural resource people. And in this case, it was rather easy to find, because on my second or third day, there was a guy passing me on a bike, and he had a T-shirt that said, "This is what an awesome forester looked like." So basically, following that person right to Kroon Hall, where we are today. As Karen has said in her introduction, I work with the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development. And not many people know this organization. There are 3 organizations in the UN that are focused on food security and agriculture, and they're all Rome-based. And IFAD is the one that has a double nature as an international financial institution, so providing loans and grants to countries, a bit like the World Bank, African Development, Asian Development Bank, and on the other hand, it has a United Nations entity. It's a specialized agency. And the objective of IFAD is to invest in agricultural investment programs that reduce poverty in rural areas of developing countries. So it is a comparably well-defined, narrow mandate. There's not much jumping around between, urban and rural issues. So the focus is really on smallholder farmers in developing countries. What I would like to talk to you about today, and this is more of a conversation starter so that we understand the context in which we work, is the role of smallholders in the whole space of climate action, climate change adaptation, but also climate change mitigation. And I thought that it might be useful to recap some of the things that many of you will know already, but that are always useful to keep in mind again. Agriculture, in the whole discussion about climate change, has always had a bit of an ambiguous situation. Agriculture is a big part of the problem. So as the IPCC report has shown us, around 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to agriculture-related activities and land use conversion. And you can see, it comes from different sources: enteric fermentation of livestock, fertilizer production, paddy rice, and so forth. But on the other hand, agriculture is not only a cause of the problem, it's also a victim of global warming. So when you look into all the projections, all the things that scientists tell us about staple crop productivity in developing countries, we see that there is a downhill trend. So the latest projections that I've seen are, when you average out 8 staple crops, then by 2050 we can have up to 8% less production of these staple crops. And that means we are going down a very difficult road, where on the one hand we perpetuate the problem, and on the other hand we suffer the consequences of the problem. So what we need is a new paradigm. And unfortunately, when you look at agriculture, then compared with other sectors, we are around 20, 30 years behind the curve, right? We are still managing our landscapes, and we are still producing our food as if there is no tomorrow. So there is still a distribution of farming in the world, where on the one hand you have the big industrialized farming systems that are very much geared towards monocropping, very resource intensive, have a big environmental footprint. Then on the other hand, you have small farms that are very often not as productive as they could be because of lack of choices, lack of access to technology, information, and financing. Other sectors like energy or transport, over the past 20 to 30 years, we have seen many innovations in the way we move, in the way we cook, in the way we cool, in the way we pump. Agriculture still very much the same carbon footprint. So the term climate smart agriculture has been coined in order to throw out a paradigm that we want to follow in the future. And this is essentially agriculture that has 3 characteristics. The first one is it's agriculture that needs to be more productive. By 2050, there are projections that we will have 9 billion people living on this planet. The bulk of that population growth is expected to take place in developing countries. So we need to feed more people with the same land that we have available. We also need to build agricultural systems that are more resilient to climate-related shocks and stresses. Basically, floods, the occurrence of floods, the occurrence of droughts, the occurrence of tropical storms is hitting the food production in many developing countries. And so there needs to be a new kind of thinking that goes into how we manage our landscapes and how we develop buffer zones so that agricultural production does not get knocked out by these events. And then thirdly, there should be agriculture that has a lower carbon footprint. So agricultural systems that do not contribute to the problem. So this is the term climate smart agriculture, and this is the context in which we work. The question, right? How do we really get to these farming systems? It sounds very nice in theory. So 3 ingredients, like a cookbook recipe. But it's not that easy in real life. And very often, I think it is not really easy because we have such a dispersed and diverse constituency working in agriculture. This is why I want to start the conversation about smallholder farmers in developing countries. The first thing I want to mention is that when you hear the term smallholder farmers in developing countries, then the perception that gets triggered by many people is one of poverty and is one of humanitarian assistance. So when people hear smallholder farmer in Africa, people think drought, disaster. And sometimes, this picture gets perpetuated also by people in climate change conferences who keep repeating that urgent action is needed, poor people are on the front lines of climate change. But then we have had that rhetoric for the past 20 years or so, and it is really difficult to pin down people who have said that smallholder farmers are on the front lines, but have at the same time opened basically a battle against the prevailing institutional structures that have sustained the status quo. Right? So smallholder farmers in developing countries are not perceived as something like this. They're not perceived as entrepreneurs who have innovation potential, market potential, or someone like this. This is a lady from Bangladesh that has just started to diversify her income sources from rice farming into also duck rearing. So a first takeaway message I would like to leave here is that when we talk about smallholder farmers in developing countries, please try to see them as enterprises, as businesses. as innovators. And they are actually also the ones that sustain the food system in many of these countries. There are over 500 million small farms, and they provide livelihoods to over 2 billion people. So it's a massive constituency. And these smallholder farmers produce up to 80% of food in developing countries. For those of you who are interested, there's a really good report out there from FAO last year called The Economic Lives of Smallholder Farmers. There are 8 case studies where basically comparisons are made. How many smallholder farmers are there? How much food do they produce? How much access to market do they have? How do they live? And as you can see here, the situation is very diverse. Some countries such as Vietnam and Bangladesh, for example, have over 10 million smallholder farms. Other countries such as Bolivia, they have 1 or 2 million. But the production, the agricultural production of the country is about 80% through these smallholder farms. So depending on country, the situation varies, but smallholder farmers are very important for food production. If smallholder farmers get into trouble, then people go hungry. Smallholder farmers are also interfacing with some of the planet's most sensitive ecosystems. This is important to keep in mind because very often, as environmentalists, we look at the health of biodiversity in the country, we look at the health of the coral reefs, the rainforests. Potentially, there can be an opportunity, but we have seen it in the past very much as a risk. So this is an older map from FAO based on satellite imagery and population density data, where they have plotted the prevalence of stunting among children under 5 in densely populated areas against the major biodiversity areas. And you can see that there is an overlap. So many poor people in the world are living in areas where we have very wealthy and rich biodiversity. And if poverty prevails in these areas, that means people have no other choice than to unsustainably extract natural resources from these areas. So I think this has been very early recognized as a risk, but it has not sufficiently been recognized as an opportunity. So basically, if you can tackle the issue of poverty in developing countries, you can also generate a very positive ripple effect on biodiversity conservation and on the conservation of ecosystem services. So when we talk about working with smallholder farmers in the context of international development and poverty reduction, then the world is generally divided in 3 spheres. We can either work in an agriculture-based economy where agriculture is a significant contributor to the GDP. Poverty in these countries is very often concentrated in rural areas. So when we want to reduce that poverty, we need to work with smallholder farmers and see how we can use smallholder farming as an engine for growth and for poverty reduction. Transforming economies are slightly different because their agriculture, in terms of the contribution to GDP, is less important, but poverty still remains overwhelmingly a rural phenomenon. There are rising tensions, a rising gap between urban and rural areas. So the approach of many development partners is to develop and stimulate a non-farm economy in rural areas so that people can get jobs. And then there are the urbanized economies where agriculture contributes only a little to growth. It's one out of many competitive, tradable sectors where poverty reduction is very often targeted or tackled through job creation activities outside of the agriculture area. This is still a bit of a background to tell you where many of the UN agencies come from, where they try to find their leverage points for poverty reduction. We're going then into the climate story in just a minute. IFAD, the organization I work with, is investing around $1 billion per year into agricultural investment programs with the aim to reduce poverty. And this is being done with a theory of change in mind. And this theory of change is that poverty reduction requires the empowerment of smallholder farmers to seize new economic opportunities. This is not a humanitarian mandate, right? This is about considering smallholders as active parts of the economy. And this requires investment in projects which do a number of things. First of all, inform small producers about market demand and market pricing so that they know how and when to bring their goods to market. It's about increasing investments from the private sector in businesses and value chains that smallholder farmers have access to and can tap into. It's about increasing the access of smallholders to knowledge, to loan financing, to inputs, to technology. It's also about reducing transaction costs throughout a value chain and making sure that a larger share of the value created across the value chain stays in the hands of the smallholder farmers and does not just dissipate in the space where we have middlemen. So this is basically the way many of IFAD's poverty reduction programs are framed, trying to get smallholders access to markets, recognizing their potential as enterprises. And this is then where we start our narrative about climate change. It's not a very, I would say, not a very intuitive story, but it fits really well. If you think about how a value chain generally looks like in rural areas, it starts with the stage of production. And production is, and this is not shown in this graph, but production is generally supported also by inputs, fertilizer, pesticides. So someone is supplying small producers with inputs. But alone at the production side, you can have climate-related problems emerge that then undermine the entire value chain. So when you think about growing maize in a rural area of Nigeria and you have a drought, then part of the production gets knocked out. And as part of the production gets knocked out, the effects ripple through the value chain. So anyone who is basically dependent on that value chain, be it the truck driver who needs to bring the bags with the maize to the market, they don't have jobs, they don't have income. At the processing or storage stage, you can have, like we have seen in the case of Bangladesh, you can see processing plants, storage systems knocked out by tropical storms, for example. You can have smaller creeping problems, with pest infestations, with mold, anything, that is sensitive to humidity, to temperature that can happen at the storage stage. You can have landslides or floods interrupt access routes to market. And then you can have a situation where all the smallholders are forced to throw all their product out on the market at the same time, and the price goes down, and they do not have sufficient income for their labor. So basically, climate change acts as a risk multiplier in many rural value chains. But at the same time, there are adaptation options that can be undertaken in order to manage these kind of risks. So in this particular case, crop trials, community-based crop trials, trying out a few different maize varieties to see how they perform in different climatic conditions. Improving processing and storage systems. We have examples in Rwanda where basically we support the creation of processing hubs with green energy, with solar panels, solar pumping, solar cooling. But in the simplest of cases, it's just enough to put bags, sealable, watertight bags into the storage chain, and you protect a large amount of your income. In transport, there is a lot of stuff we can do in terms of building codes for rural roads, for feeder roads, slope stabilization, planting trees on hillsides, above road surfaces to make sure that landslides are mitigated. And then systems about price information, systems about diversification of these value chains so that people can market different types of crops at different times and decide which types of crops they put on market is another more downstream activity, adaptation activity in value chains. So all that to say, right, in the context of poverty reduction, when we use this organizing principle of a value chain as an entry point for poverty reduction, then climate action and climate adaptation has a really good space there. And it's a good investment to make because you are not only looking at one farmer and one household plot, you're looking at a system. And that system basically has interdependencies. These interdependencies are important if we want to look at scale. So how do we do it in practice, right? The program that I coordinate is called the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Programme, ASAP. So we gave it that acronym to signify the urgency of the issue, ASAP, as soon as possible. At the moment, we have 366 million US dollars that is provided by 10 bilateral donors that we integrate with agricultural investment programs. Many of these agricultural investment programs are loan-based. There are different types of loans. If you're a higher middle-income country, those are ordinary terms. If you're a lower middle-income country or a least developed country, these are either grants only or highly concessional loans, interest-free loans. And basically, into these programs that deal with the whole value chain aspect of development, we integrate the climate pieces, right? So we have 44 projects now underway in all parts of the world, where the government works with IFAD to frame value chain projects to support poverty reduction, and then we come in with a grant to increase climate resilience and try to promote climate-smart agriculture. So by putting these grants in, we create usually a new space for conversation with governments. And there are three new things, right, that happen through these grants. There's always, when I started to work at IFAD, interestingly, many people would ask me, so now we're talking about climate change adaptation. Is this not just new, old wine in new bottles? We have always been doing, rainwater harvesting. We've always worked in drought zones. So what is so new in that program? Do we not just rebrand it in order to get more donor money? And looking at this question, a few years later, it's very clear that through that program we are doing three new things that have not happened before. And this is a very interesting finding, because you would think that when you go into a developing country in sub-Saharan Africa and you talk with the agriculture ministry, that people would automatically be talking about climate all the time, because fisheries need climate, forests, all dependent on the weather. Natural resources are all dependent on the weather. But the perspective of many of these ministries was very strongly economical, right? So it was about yields, it was about profits, it was about revenues from agriculture. And the sustainability angle, whether we will still have soils, whether we will still have healthy water resources in 5 years' time, that did not very much come into play. So that money was important on the one hand as an incentive to start a conversation about climate-related risks in agriculture, in different value chains. But it was also important to now pin down where the risks are and which value chains are likely to take a hit. Now, this is an example about the suitability of coffee growing in Nicaragua. This was the organization that helped us with this is CIAT. It's a member of the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, CGIAR. They have a very vibrant climate change project, and we source many experts from there who are already specialized in certain value chains. So when you look at the red zones here, this is based on climate models, the suitability for coffee growing in Nicaragua, and we were looking at Arabica coffee. Then we see that by 2050, in the red zones, it will be very, very difficult to grow Arabica coffee because it will be too hot for the plants. So you need to, in a sense, migrate the planting of the coffee plants up in terms of altitude, where it's a bit cooler. So people who have land and are currently growing Arabica coffee will have a more difficult time. At the same time, we did the same analysis with cocoa. There is potential for cocoa to go into these areas, so you can diversify the value chain. So if you're a smallholder farmer who has all eggs in his or her one basket only, then you can diversify, and now rather than farming coffee only, you can go into cocoa. but it requires some additional support in developing such a value chain. So that example shows that, after, we have started to create that space for dialogue with governments, we need to also frame that project very clearly and come with very visual and very concrete numbers. Also, the economic valuation of climate impacts is a very powerful tool. I know that F&ES is doing a lot of work in that space. Professor Mendelsohn is doing a lot of that. So if you can go to a government with numbers or with a map like that, that creates a lot of interest, creates a lot of space for dialogue. The second thing that these climate funds create is having the agriculture ministries consider technologies that are normally not in their DNA. A good example, I think, is the use of hydrometeorological information. In many developing countries, there is a silo mentality between the hydromet people and the agriculture people. There's not much information flow. And very often, when I ask why that is, people tell me that, when we provide wrong forecasts, even if they 7 out of 10 times they're right and 3 out of 10 times they're wrong, I give people the wrong advice on when to plant, for example, then first of all, I lose my job. And second of all, people go hungry. People have virtually no space to take risks. Smallholder farmers, they need accurate information. That's the response that I often get. So it's high risk, and if you don't get it right, then you're at fault for making people go hungry. But at the same time, this is not an argument, because there are many studies out there that show when you provide people with access to information and you also inform them about the probability of that information. Basically, when you tell them 7 out of 10 times it works, then people make autonomous decisions that are much more informed and that are better. People can independently interpret much of that information. So basically, innovation in climate risk management is important for agriculture ministries, but also ministries of public works and others. And here are just some examples. So I talked about the crop trials. I talked about weather information. Insurance is another complementary element that can fit into such a value chain, making infrastructure more flexible, more robust. We've worked on submersible roads in Bangladesh, for example, post-harvest protection in Rwanda, green cooling, green pumping in Uganda. So a number of a toolbox that you can bring to bear. And thirdly, and this is, I think, something that we have grappled with, for years, is sustainable management of natural resources. This is really, when you talk about old wine in new bottles, this is the old wine, right? That doesn't mean that the old wine is not important. This is nothing that is super new or rocket science. These are sustainable natural resource management models that we have, that we know for 20, 30 years. We have seen them. We have seen the benefits of agroforestry. We have seen the benefits of conservation agriculture, integrated water management, watershed management. What we have not really got wired is how can we get these natural resource management practices to a critical scale? What are the institutional pathways? What are the political champions we need? What are the fiscal spaces? So basically, that climate money that we provide goes into that gap, into that deficit, right? It does not go into now research about, the benefits of agroforestry in the case of Uganda. It goes into the institutional analysis. Why are all these pilots that we've had on agroforestry, why are they not just spreading by themselves? What's needed? What do we need? Do we need subsidy? Do we need more awareness? What is the underlying root cause for these things not going to scale? And in some countries, we use extension services as entry points. In other countries, we use policy as an entry point. In other countries, we use private sector engagement as an entry point to try and get these systems to a more critical scale. So those are the three things that I would say are new in the way we use climate finance in the context of these value chain systems. And just a quick example also, I think along the same lines, again, going through these three elements. we are working in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta, where the government has a strategy to intensify rice farming. Certain rice varieties fetch a very high price, and a big part of the revenue into the country is selling that type of rice to China. At the same time, in the Mekong Delta, which is the rice basket of the country, we see sea level rise. And sea level rise materializes in salinity moving further inland. So all of a sudden, when you talk to farmers and they dip their finger into the water that comes out from their wells, they taste salty water, which they have not in the past, or they have salty water in their rice fields further inland, which they have not had in the past. So this is new, and it is important to understand how the salinity in the Mekong Delta behaves based on natural cycles, based also on people opening and closing sluice gates somewhere in the delta. So in the end, the space that we created to talk with the government about was, is rice farming in the Mekong Delta in the future still a sustainable way of creating economic returns? So the smallholder farmers who are now dependent fully on farming that 1 or 2 types of rice, how are they gonna fare in 5 to 10 years? And looking into the climate change projections, we see that rice growing area is likely to go back in the Mekong Delta. Salinity will be more of a problem. So the pool and the suite of interventions that we suggested and that we are working on now with the smallholder farmers, with the communities, they have 4 threads. The first one is salinity monitoring. This is very much a research piece that we work on with universities in Vietnam, basically installing saltwater or salt salinity monitoring systems along a salinity gradient around 40 kilometers inland, just to detect, how these salinity lines are moving, how they are moving when we turn on certain wheels of that system. Then there is also one thread about diversifying from crop only into mixed crop aquaculture systems, breeding a strand of more salinity resistant catfish, and diversifying income streams outside of agriculture. So basically empowering people who are now able to sell, for example, the sludge from the catfish ponds as fertilizer further inland and connecting them to transport and market opportunities. So this is the second part, basically introducing innovation into these value chains. And lastly, there is this mechanism that we are trying to build to make the knowledge from these adaptation interventions available to the government, so that the government can make more informed planning decisions. Vietnam is still a country where you have very well-connected layers from the national to the provincial to the district, so that this is very permeable, whereas in other countries that system is pretty much broken, right? But in Vietnam, when the national government basically tries to advocate for certain investments in certain provincial or district budgets, then usually that gets executed as a former central planning economy. And an integrative knowledge management system, which in our view needs to combine the indigenous knowledge, the findings from the community-based crop trials, the findings from the salinity monitoring systems. These 2 things need to be combined. So the academic and the community-based knowledge, they need to feed into one system so that eventually the budget allocation and the planning processes can absorb a meaningful outcome. Lastly, in Vietnam, I think we do a very good job on impact assessments. So many of you will know the work that J-PAL does at MIT, and you will be probably, or some of you will be engaged in similar impact assessments, where you have control groups, where you have treatment groups, where you try to attribute the outcome or the impact of a particular intervention to a particular investment. So in Vietnam, there is a very high readiness and willingness to use experimental designs, randomized control trials in the impact analysis. Okay, final word here about mitigation, right? I've talked a lot about climate risk management now, risk-informed programming. I have not talked a lot about greenhouse gas emission reductions. And I have not done that because when you talk to a smallholder farmer somewhere in Asia or in Africa, greenhouse gases are just not, on their mind, very, very naturally so. So they have issues related to water, to health, education, and the adaptation investments that we are promoting, they speak to these more basic requirements and more basic needs. What we want to do is appraise whether these investments also make a positive difference on the global climate. And we did a first, I would say, quick and dirty study using an ex-ante carbon assessment tool by FAO. We took a sample of 13 ASAP-supported projects and found that potentially they can reduce emissions by 30 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. So this is all without putting projects on the ground that have a particular climate change mitigation objective. This is just by working on the resilience of rural value chains, the resilience of smallholder farmers. So if you invest climate money into these resilience projects, then you're also getting some bang for the buck on climate change mitigation. This is an argument that we try to make also at the international climate change negotiations, where people always talk about climate finance. And our statement there is always, smallholder farmers are great clients for climate finance because they generate multiple benefits for poverty reduction, economic growth, for climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. Okay, I think we're almost out of time. If I had to frame 3 take-home messages from this call, and again, I see it as a conversation starter, so I will be available then all through the semester. Anyone who is interested working in this space, poverty reduction, smallholder farming, climate change adaptation, is very welcome to also have then more informal conversations about this. But if I had to frame for a broader audience 3 take-home messages, the first one would be, if you hear smallholder farmers, think businesses, think SOM, think, these are entrepreneurs. They invest, they manage risk, they have assets. They work in difficult conditions, but they are businesses. And in the rural space, when you think about scale issues, then think value chains and landscapes. Don't necessarily think village with household and farm plot, right? The value chains create that ripple effect of an informed investment. And the third one is that smallholder adaptation generates multiple benefits in public goods if it is done right, for food security, biodiversity conservation, and emission reductions. Of course, there are questions, like everyone, in a UN agency investing in these things. You have many theories for change. You have 44 projects now on the ground. Some will work very well, others will not work so well. The questions that arise are, on the one side, how can we generate more private sector investment? Under which conditions does it work? We often target private sector investments in the designs of these projects, but it is not always picking up. We can see some examples where it works well and others where it doesn't. So what are the preconditions? We have a question around gender. Is it automatically empowering for women if you invest in resilience in the smallholder space? Because women have a similar problem like smallholders in the international perception, right? Women are very often being seen as very vulnerable, right? But again, women are very, very important agents for change in the rural space. They manage the household, they manage the water, they manage the natural resources, and we very often do not put them into the center of the agency in these projects, which needs to change. So there is a really important question around gender equality and women's empowerment in the space of climate change adaptation. Then again, the question I've already raised: what are the most effective institutional pathways to bring sustainable landscape management to change, to scale? We are learning more and more, I think, also outside of the field of climate change adaptation, but there is still a lot of work to do and a lot of research. And what is the political economy of adaptation decision-making in different countries, right? So many people have now realized that climate finance is a potential new income stream into an economy, can substantiate ODA, in some places even replace ODA, but who is benefiting from the decision making about where this funding should be invested and where it comes from. Okay, I have no further slides. I put some of the resources that I put into this presentation, but I very much look forward now to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so we definitely left lots of time for questions, and we have microphones. So raise your hand. We have 2 microphones, so keep your hands high. I know some folks have to head to class. Okay, we have a question here and a question back there.
Hey, my name's Matt Maroney, first year MEM. Thank you for your work. My question is, how does IFAD avoid a shift towards monoculture as you fund increased mechanization?
We take both questions, or yeah.
Hi, I'm Sharda Vadlamani. I'm a first year MEM student. My question is, how much is IFAD focusing on processing, supply chain, and storage initiatives, which could engage some people from the smallholder farmer community, especially in seasons where the bulk of farming is not viable?
Question in regards to smallholder farming and greenhouse gases. Being that you said it's not on their minds as they're primarily focusing on their livelihood and feeding their family, I'm wondering what you're doing to demote animal husbandry, as it is insanely water and energy intensive, as well as emits more greenhouse gases than the production of food for people and not food for food.
Okay. All very, very good questions. Thank you. Okay, monoculture. There is a big. I think when you look at resilient systems, then one characteristic of a resilient system is diversity, right? So automatically, a farming system that rests on different legs, so to speak, is more resilient than a farming system that only relies on one crop. So for us, there is, I think, a very big push towards diversification. And diversification is also what we would call a no regrets investment. So climate models, are still, they're for insights. They don't give you answers, right? Climate models give you maybe a boundary condition for your planning. You can do your scenario planning, but they do not tell you how the weather is going to be in July 2020. So in the absence of that certainty, a diversified system always makes more sense. The only issue that you need to look for is there a market for things, right? So when we look into a typical diversified system, it would be you plant banana trees in a coffee plantation, right? And that has multiple benefits. So the banana leaves, they shade the coffee, and at the same time you have a different crop, a second crop that you can bring to market. Certain countries like Nepal, all of a sudden, have opportunities to grow banana. Rice goes down, but you can grow fruit trees all of a sudden in higher altitudes. Those are new opportunities that we need to consider. So, in answer to your question, yes, it's very much on our minds. Processing, supply chain, storage. I mean, it's again, there cannot be, I think, an investment in poverty reduction that does not go beyond production. Maybe in the past, we've had too much of a narrow focus on the production side. And especially, when you talk to people who work in climate adaptation, they still see production as the most central part of the value chain to invest in. But storage is super key, because if you have an extreme climate event, for example, and you're not able to store your produce in a dry and safe place, then you cannot use that produce at another point in time. So storage is key. And I think we have a few very nice examples of where we have invested climate finance into storage systems, and I'll be happy then to share them with you if you would like. The demoting of animal husbandry. Well, there is obviously not such a simple solution as to say, let's just replace livestock with other things, right? In many countries, people depend on livestock. However, what you also see is that the reason why people keep livestock is very often like a bit of an insurance system, right? So in Sudan, for example, or also in Lesotho for that matter, people have large herds, and these herds, they consume water, they consume grass, right? They trample the ground, so they erode the landscape. And it's not that people absolutely always need such large flocks for generating an income, but they do not have a market any other than for maybe the butter or maybe the milk. So in some cases, we try to create value chains for red meat, for example, so that people can sell or reduce the size of their flocks and sell the meat on the market. But this is very difficult in countries such as Sudan or countries such as Lesotho, which have a very, very small internal market. So there, a big part of trying to find a solution is brokering agreements with other countries like South Africa, in the case of Lesotho, for example, to buy some of the meat. And this is really a difficult, I would say, a difficulty that we have at the moment. So it's, my answer to your question is, it's important to understand why people have livestock, which part of a livelihood system the livestock serves. Is it for the milk? Is it then if a drought hits, that they have insurance, that they have something to sell, that they have something to fall back on? Or how is the situation? How does it look like? I would not say that automatically phasing out animal husbandry and phasing something in is the low-hanging fruit there. It's more working with what people have and diversifying into other income sources that will then automatically reduce the livestock size in many of these countries.
For another round of questions, yes.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering what you are doing or thinking about the following. When I was in Bhutan, people are complaining that people are flocking to the cities. I think this is a relatively worldwide phenomenon. So in your value chain, I guess, the figure that's off the chart is who's going to grow the food. Many young people want to come to universities or have computers and are flooding to cities. Who's going to be the farmers, the small farmers of the future?
So I wanted to pick up on the cities part and talk about scale a little bit. My assumption when you're talking about smallholder access to markets, they're probably local or regional markets. Gordon was talking about the urbanization trend that's taking place, and many of the supply chains that serve big cities are part of global food supply chains. Can you talk a little bit about the interrelationship between the smallholder supply chains, if you will, and the global agricultural supply chains, and how you see them connecting or not going forward?
So the two ahead of me took my question, so I'm going to modify it a little bit. Just to add to that, resilience and creating resilient systems is also being critiqued as we are trying to keep the system in the same way, right? Often what we are trying to do is often also transformation. We're trying to ask people to move beyond what their current situations are. So if you want to respond to that in a kind of a general framework of your 41 large projects.
It occurred to me while you were speaking that if you, alleviate poverty, then the mothers and the children will be better fed, and perhaps population growth will slow down. But then I realized from my very limited knowledge of this that often, even when there's less poverty, there's not better nutrition. People don't necessarily understand how to avoid stunting, for example. So I'm wondering how this, if thinking about nutrition fits in with the programs that you oversee.
All right. Well, okay. Now these are pretty big now. All of them. I mean, we would be able to have a separate session about it. Urbanization, yeah, I agree. I mean, agriculture is not a very nice prospect for many young people. And this is because they do not see business opportunities in agriculture. They see agriculture as something you have to work very hard for and you get very little returns from. And particularly, you know, in settings such as Bhutan, where you have very remote people, very remote, you know, you have very difficult access routes. It's a very difficult and hard business to be a farmer in Bhutan or in the Himalayas or in any other country for that matter. One thing that we sometimes try to show the government is that there are options to create value chains in rural areas that are not particularly directly related to growing crops. An example is there is an entrepreneur that got a little grant from IFAD and developed a portable biogas device. Basically, biogas, you can fill it with animal waste, and you can take it around with you and generate electricity with it. So there are value chains, or there are technologies that you can potentially build a value chain around, that are not directly related to growing crops, but related to clients in the rural space who need access to energy, for example. So especially in what we would call green technologies, I think there's a lot of space for also young entrepreneurs who latch on to the issue of, you know, providing energy, providing cooking sources, you know, fuel-efficient cook stoves, bringing down the price of drip irrigation kits so that you can grow a little home garden. So there are value chains in there, in that there are opportunities for businesses in there that are not directly crop related, but we can I think talk much more about this. The question about global supply chains, I mean, I would have to say very, very plainly, it is a super, super difficult thing to get big multinational companies to source from smallholder farmers. There are a few value chains, I think, where it has already made, you know, a bit of a difference. Coffee, I think, is a good example. You know, coffee, you can put a nice label on there. I think the whole labeling question comes in. Sustainable production, you need to label where things are sourced, how they are sourced. There is a willingness. I think there's a market for these products. But for staple crops, for example, for milk, also for those products where you need a certain degree of quality threshold, it is super difficult. An example is, again, Lesotho. We're looking at wool and mohair value chains. And just the way, you know, people are shearing their goats and sheep, you know, it's with such rudimentary instruments and basic instruments that the wool just does not have the quality, right? So first, before you can do that, before you can connect basically with a value chain that spans to South Africa, and you have a South African purchaser for the product, you need to first make sure that you establish shearing sheds, that these shearing sheds have electrical equipment, not the scissors that very often hurt the animals, and then, you know, you have a product that is just not up to quality. So you need to first work on the quality of the product, and then broker. Once you have the quality, then you broker a relationship with someone who can use the product. But in our experience, very often when we work with multinational companies and try to source or have them buy smallholder products, it's more under the heading of corporate social responsibility. And the markets, the national markets are, I think, more the low-hanging fruit. So the first stage. And then when the quality has increased, you know, you think broader, you think regional, or you think international. And then the point of nutrition obviously is, I mean, when you remember the slide with the three agriculture worlds, right? The agrarian societies, the transition economies, the urbanized, the agrarian societies still have the biggest problem also with nutrition. In IFAD, just institutionally, we have a nutrition mainstreaming initiative. It's similar to, it comes with pros and cons, right? I'm now in a sense, leading the climate mainstreaming initiative in IFAD, right? And we have money to plug into investment programs, and then we open that space for discussion about climate risk management. And nutrition is an equally important topic, but we don't have money. There is no nutrition finance. There are maybe small funds, some donors who take that issue to heart, but we need to mainstream nutrition into the project without any additional finance. So there needs to be a different qualitative angle to what we do. And every country program manager in IFAD needs to have nutrition also in the back of their minds to make sure that, whenever we invest in poverty reduction, then we also do not forget that nutrition is a very big pillar in a healthy household. And I'm also happy to then share, this nutrition policy that we have and give you a few examples of how we did it in a few countries. But again, great questions. Probably, a lot of time for additional conversations right thereafter or at another occasion.
One last question.
An easy one, please.
You spoke about research to identify institutional barriers to technology dissemination. I'm wondering if you could speak in general about the strategies you're taking to address different kinds of property rights, physical in terms of land tenure, but also when it comes to intellectual property rights, and if entry into various trade treaties and agreements where intellectual property rights are treated in a different way, if you view this as more of a barrier or more of an opportunity for dissemination of some of these technologies.
Well, I would say that the issue of land rights is the key impediment for many development interventions. If you're working with smallholder farmers who do not own the land on which they farm, then there is automatically also a different type of natural resource management taking place, right? So very often what these IFAD-supported projects do, they have one component. If we're working in a context where people don't have land rights, then we have one component that is particularly about that. But as you will know, land rights are a very, very difficult political issue, kind of hot potato. Very, very seldomly, do international organizations, touch land rights. But I have to say that, I've seen projects in our portfolio that really, make the point very clearly that if land rights are not sorted out in this particular intervention, then the theory of change is not going to work. You need people who take ownership of the land on which they work and farm, and you need to also build a recognition, or you need to invest in the landscape that is still treated as a free resource, right? So if people cut down trees on the slopes because no one owns that land and it's a free resource, then it's also a very big impediment for a resilient value chain. So maybe it does not answer your question very, very accurately, but the land rights issue, I think, is squarely in the field of vision of the baseline projects that we work with, right? And it needs to be, it's part of the contextual analysis in which these investments are being made. And then the second one I did not quite, so you're talking about intellectual property rights of the innovations that are being, well, there I would have to say that most of the things that we work with are not technological innovations in the sense of you develop a new technology. It's usually, things that have been around, right? Rainwater harvesting, these landscape management approaches, drip irrigation, treadle pumps. It's not innovation for us, is more transferring a particular technology from a context where it has already been well disseminated and dispersed into a context where it would be needed or could be useful, but people are not using it yet, right? So we do not run into intellectual property rights in this context.